everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Rise of Henry VIII podcast. I am absolutely delighted to welcome today's guest, Sasha Marks, aka the True Astrologer, and we're going to be talking about Tudor astrology today. How are you today, Sasha?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for having me in this interview. I totally appreciate it, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
It is absolutely my pleasure. And just for those who don't know about you or your blog, can you just explain to us what the Tudor Astrologer talks about and why you think it's so interesting?
Yes, my first interest in my life was the Tudors and astrology kind of at the same time, but I never really put them together. And a few years ago, I started to think about it and I started to put them together and realized that this is very rarely done. There's a few here and there pop articles on, what sign is Anne Boleyn or something like that, but not really anything in depth with, the level of study that I have done. And 2.5 years ago, I began the Instagram page, and people seem to like it and give me a good positive response. And so I have developed it since then. So on my Instagram page, Tudor.Astrology, I look at people and events of the Tudor era. Not all my posts are astrological, but they are somehow informed by the wisdom of astrology, even if I don't mention it. And so basically, I have seen so many interesting, fascinating correspondences that I feel it is a good way for Tudor fans to see something different than what they normally are reading. And for astrology enthusiasts or people who love that subject can see it actually in action, which is very interesting because astrology as a subject is actually much more presented theoretically and conceptually. And it's very rare that you get to see what exactly is, a king with a Cancer sun and how does that actually unfold. And we're talking about Henry VIII here, of course. At any rate, so to me, both segments of people would find it maybe fascinating to combine these two subjects. And that's what I do.
And do you feel that the fact that astrology in relation to the Tudors is not talked about a lot, do you think that's what motivated you to create the blog and why you're so passionate about it is that it's not talked about as much?
Yes, and I think the reason is because it's very rare to find somebody who has an interest in the Tudors and also an interest in astrology. It just so happened in my life that I followed both those paths, but the average person is going to be interested in one or the other, and or maybe none. But you're not going to really find that many. But I have found in my account a clear group of people that enjoy it and have some astrological background and knowledge and are interested in the Tudors. So it is sort of like a new interdisciplinary subject that appeals to a certain kind of person, a person who likes history, but also wants to see the meaning of it in a larger context than just the material historical context.
It's interesting that you say that because before finding your blog, I had absolutely no idea about how the Tudors and astrology work together. And it's so fascinating to see that so many people find your blog and become interested in it. And I think that's the great thing about your blog is that you don't have to know a lot about astrology to find it fascinating because you on your blog talk about it and you kind of write about it in a way that you don't have to have a big knowledge of it. And I think that's something that you do quite well is that I myself wasn't an expert, but I feel like I'm becoming one through your blog.
Well, thank you. I am really, at base a teacher. That has always sort of my life. When I graduate school, I taught English literature, I taught languages, taught English in Germany. So I have a sort of teacherly type approach to things, which is always, never think that somebody knows everything and that you have to talk to them at an advanced level. The actual posts are meant to teach basic concepts of astrology. If I mention the sign of Cancer, I will go and mention what Cancer represents. I don't just assume that somebody will know it. it is a form, my account is a form of teaching astrology with the examples of the Tudor age and Tudor personages and Tudor events. How does astrology really work? So it is a teaching method. And I thank you very much for observing that, because astrology is a very complex subject, and pop astrology is a simplified version. The kind of astrology many people follow today is a simplified version of it. So I'm trying to bridge this gap there and show what it really is and how it can be used and how you can understand things better once you have model or paradigm to look at it through, that lens to look at it through.
I think that's just so fascinating, is that we have so much information about astrology in the Tudor times, and that's kind of the purpose of what we're talking about today, because a lot of people know what astrology was used for in the Tudor times and what certain things meant. So I think that that's something that we can talk about. Is, do you believe astrology meant to the Tudors? What did it represent for them?
Well, it wasn't walking into a pub and saying to somebody, "What's your sign?" It was not that. That type of astrology emerged much later, once people began to be more psychological and more self-reflexive. In the Tudor era, in that period of time, and before that, in the Middle Ages, and going back to the beginning of astrology several thousand years ago, astrology was used to describe the structure of the cosmos. This is what the universe was made of, the planets, and it was used to study how the planets, and the sun and the moon, by the way, are considered planets in the Tudor era and in astrology today as well. In that age, they only had 7 planets. They only had the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And they didn't have Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto as we use today. But that doesn't mean that they were not effective in some way. It's just that the people didn't know about them. And so what astrologers would do, their job was basically similar to what astronomers would do today. They would study the sky, study the cosmos, and they would come up with their mathematical relationships. And through those relationships, they would be able to predict events or elect a moment in the future where something auspicious would happen. That was the purpose of it. The purpose of it is that you would maybe go to an astrologer and you would say, "When will I be able to get married?" And then that astrologer would give you that answer based on the relationship of the planets and at the moment that you ask the question. So horary astrology, which is what that branch of astrology is called, that was a big thing. You know, and you hear about it, for example, in Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, that they had astrologers predict that Anne's child, the one that was to be Elizabeth I, was going to be a son. And you read that all the time. Now, they obviously got it wrong. And it's an interesting reason for maybe why they got it wrong. But that's the kind of thing that it was used for. We also know Elizabeth asked John Dee to predict or to come up with the moment for her coronation. That's another purpose of it. Tell me the best time to go and have this event happen. And then he obviously picked a wonderful moment for her. So it had nothing to do with, I'm a Scorpio and he's a Virgo, and do we get together and will that work out? That's modern astrology. That's not the astrology of the Tudor era. But in my account, just as an aside, I use modern astrology to look at the Tudors. I don't limit myself to just what they did back then.
And would you say that, in a sense, the Tudors had a bit more sophistication to astrology? It seems to be highly regarded and treated almost as something sacred, or almost like religion, almost.
Yes, they did. I would say that from what we know, Henry VII certainly was interested in astrology. There are astrologers at his court. Obviously, Henry VIII did too. You can see with the clock at Hampton Court, it was astrologically formulated as well. It gave astrological information, the phases of the moon, where the moon was, The moon is generally the most important quote unquote planet in astrology because it's closest to the earth and it moves the fastest. Basically use the moon as a sort of indicator of things. Obviously Elizabeth, who ascended to the throne, her friend, future Earl of Leicester, but Robert Dudley, was a pupil of John Dee, recommended John Dee to elect the moment for her coronation. So they did take it seriously, more so than we do today as a society. But that doesn't mean that astrologers weren't in the crosshairs of issues. I believe Henry VII fired his astrologer when he made an outrageous prediction about Elizabeth of York living until 80 years old, and then she died at 37. For Henry VIII was not happy that his astrologers told him that his child would be a boy, and it wasn't, it was a girl. So yes, so I don't know exactly how stable their relationship was with the rulers or the courts, but obviously was a part of the knowledge at that time. Yes.
And it's so interesting that you say that it was important to them, because in the Tudor times, a lot of things could be regarded or viewed as magic or witchcraft, especially people who worked with herbs or perhaps did medicine. Is there a reason perhaps that astrology wasn't regarded in association to witchcraft? Is it because it was more closely regarded as religion?
Well, I don't think it was regarded as religion. I think it was that the practitioners of astrology were men. John Dee wrote pretty much everything in Latin. He went to Cambridge. He was a scholar. He was a mathematician. Mathematics actually at that time was more problematic as a possibility of being magical, conjuring. But astrology was practiced mainly by men, and witchcraft was relegated mainly to as a female craft or art. And so you do have a gender issue here. Astrology required certain knowledge, scholarship. Witchcraft is based on more humble, or rather not something you would study in a university, and therefore was a shadow side of female empowerment that was frightening to the men that were in charge. So I would say it in that sense too. But even somebody like John Dee, who was many, many things, was somewhat given a hard time for being a conjurer and for using magic. People were afraid of that. He was actually put in prison by Queen Mary for drawing her horoscope and predicting her death. But he got out of that pretty quickly. So it was a shaky profession, I think. It was, you could get into trouble then too, but people had a connection to the universe or the cosmos as a holistic place in which they are all a part of. And therefore, the astrologer's job is to try to define that and explain that structure and use it for the benefit of kings and anybody else who wants to pay them for their knowledge.
Is there any misconceptions that we in the modern era have about astrology in Tudor times?
Well, I think that most people in the modern times now don't really know how astrology was used in the Tudor times. There is a great website called Renaissance Astrology by someone who's a specialist in this, and it would be an interesting little journey to see exactly how it was used. And it was used in a very, very different way, like I said, than what we do today. Astrology is something that has developed alongside of the development of civilization. For example, people in the Tudor era were not particularly psychologically inclined. Nobody took inner journeys as to what makes them tick and who they were or anything like that. We started to do that in the 19th century, and we started to do that in the end of the 19th century and certainly in the 20th century with psychologists like Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung or those. And we're very into that today. But at that time, they weren't. So now astrology has become a psychological craft. Try to understand our personality and who we are and all of that. It has become an aid to that. Back in the Renaissance or in the Middle Ages or in the Tudor era, people didn't think of themselves like that. And so it was much more of a thing like, for example, the moon is moist and Mars is hot, and those kinds of things that went together, like with the elements of what makes the human body and that type of thing. So I would say that science has come a long way, and we don't think that way so much anymore. But we do today still, anybody that practices astrology or is interested in it wants to see the connection between our lives and the cosmos at large. And basically, the premise is as above, so below. That same premise that existed in the Renaissance time, in the Tudor era, also exists today for anybody that's studying or interested in astrology. There is that correspondence, is the word, between what's happening in the sky and what's happening in your life or for you. Correspondence now is more symbolic, whereas back then the correspondence may have been thought to be more literal. That would be a difference. If I think that planet Jupiter is conjuncting my sun and therefore I'm going to have a certain amount of good fortune, I actually don't think that the actual planet Jupiter is actually exerting a gravitational force onto my sun placement. I see it more as a thematic symbolism that allows for that, something that we don't quite yet understand exactly how it happens. It's kind of similar that if you told Henry VIII that somebody was going to fly in an airplane and be able to fly, from England to France in an hour, he would have looked at you like you were nuts. Like, that's not possible. We don't quite know yet exactly why astrology is possible, but it seems to be. And that's the same kind of thing. There are mysteries in the universe, there are mysteries in life that we don't yet have the answer to.
And I just wanted to ask one more question in regards to the information behind astrology in Tudor England before we get on to the other section of representation. You speak a lot about rulers and astrologers. Does that mean that the common person or a lord or lady, perhaps someone a bit lower than the ruler, would not been able to afford an astrologer or perhaps did not need one?
That's exactly right. Astrology was definitely a upper class situation, not a lower class one. It's one of the reasons, for example, why we have dates and times of births of most of the rulers and people of the upper classes, but we don't have a time of birth or a date even for somebody like Anne Boleyn, whose family was a rising family. They just didn't see the need. One of the reasons why you had a date of birth for a king, to know exactly when that king came into the world, or that queen, or whoever it was so that astrologers could advise them. It was noted down so that an astrologer could cast the horoscope of the ruler and give them advice. The rest of the folks, it wasn't seen as necessary. But I do think there was an industry for merchants and for people who were up and coming in their professions to go and see astrologers and pay them exactly for the kinds of things I said. Like, for example, is my ship going to come in with my goods that I bought, or is it going to sink? And the astrologer would then go and cast a horoscope for that question, to give the answer to the question. And that is something that people did do. I would say that kept some astrologers in business as well, is answering a question for people that they had no, will I die of plague? Be like another one. I don't know how successful they were. We don't have a lot of information about that. Sometimes I think that the court astrologers, other than Dr. Dee, didn't do a particularly good job. So I don't know how successful they were. And obviously, once science became more the way to look at the world, materialistic science in the 17th century, 18th century, then astrology started to phase out as a very, common way of looking at things.
And then I think we're going to get onto the second part of talking about Tudor astrology, is that it's not really represented much in Tudor media portrayals, in that being books or, well, fiction books at least, TV shows and movie, we obviously see a lot of representation of some of their lifestyle, how they eat, their religion. Why do you think that astrology in Tudor times hasn't been represented as much in the media? Is it maybe because we don't have a lot of information, or do you just think it can't be applied to certain things?
Well, I think it has to do with, it is an area of study that people need, that takes time to learn. So I would say that the producers of such programming probably don't know enough about it, or the writers is one, is certainly that. And then they would have to not only know about astrology, but then they would have to study it in depth of how it was done at that time. But I do think that somebody should do a movie on Dr. Dee, don't you? I mean, I don't know if you are
I mean,
familiar.
I would absolutely agree, considering what I've read about him. He seems like a very fascinating person
Yes,
to do a
and
movie
also
on.
very, very likable. He got on with everybody, and it had to do with, that he had an appealing manner and way about him. And so I think that that would be a wonderful, wonderful project right there, is to look at the Tudor era from the perspective of his life and what he was doing around the time, and going to court, meeting with Elizabeth, and his time under Mary. And the interesting thing about his birth is that he was born about 2 months after Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey opened up their initial request for the divorce, which was in May of 1527. And here, John Dee was born in July of 1527. So he comes into the world at that pivotal moment. He becomes later on the astrologer that is working for Elizabeth, which is the daughter that Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn would go on to have in 1533. He wasn't that much older. We always think of John Dee as an older man, kind of like Dumbledore or something like that, but he actually was good looking and charming and interesting, and not and only about several years older than Elizabeth herself. He was a cool dude, if you want to say it that way. And I think a movie with really interesting male actor would be a wonderful thing. And it would be a way to open up this segment and this part of the Tudor era that people just simply don't have access to right now.
I think one of the only portrayals of Tudor astrology that I have seen, and I think that's something that is very interesting to talk about, is in the TV show The Tudors, which is obviously known for its historical inaccuracy. But it's actually something that I find, if I may say so, I think everybody can agree that it wasn't particularly the most historically accurate show, as more as it was the most entertaining. But we do see the scene that you have mentioned about Anne being told that her baby would be a boy. And it's not, you don't really see actual astrologer there, but we get a sense of how she would have been told and how happy it was. Do you feel like they could have done more with this, perhaps
Oh,
showed it?
sure. I mean, basically, I love the Tudors, so I'll make that statement right away. I thought it was a wonderful program in many, many ways, and it opened the era up to so many people that maybe would never have, thought of studying it or looking at it or anything like that. Yes, I mean, they had some fascinating and even some fictional characters in there, so why not have somebody that played that part and sort of was in the background, and we had a scene like that. It would have certainly fit the whole mood of the show to do that. We know that that did happen. I wrote a post about that a while ago, about the astrologer who predicted a son, and then it was obviously a female. It was obviously Elizabeth. But it's an interesting thing because people should look a little bit more, because one of the things that astrologers would have had would have been the dates of birth. And so possibly in some astrologers' notes, deep down somewhere, Anne Boleyn's date of birth, because they would have actually looked at that and needed that in order to maybe make that prediction. And so if somebody wants to find Anne Boleyn's date of birth, they should start looking in the astrological papers that might still be around somewhere.
Might it have been thrown out perhaps when Anne was executed? Perhaps somebody was
Maybe. Yes, but I'm just saying, I don't know where they are, but that would be a place where somebody would have known when she was born. She would have probably had to tell that astrologer what her date of birth was. And they
And
would
there's
have,
no way that she wouldn't have known it as well, because she can't just go and say, I don't know my age.
yes, obviously. I'm sure Anne knew her date of birth. I mean, I'm pretty sure she did. Nobody cared about it is the issue, is the point. And it wasn't an age where an individual projected themselves that much into the world by actually promoting or their birth date. Do you notice, like, for example, in newspapers, we always, whenever anybody talks about anybody in an article in a newspaper, they mention their age. It's like a thing, in our world today. It wasn't necessarily a thing back then. That's, I think, the point that I want to make about it. But yes, so yeah, that would have been great if they had developed that a little bit more. I think they should. I think they should.
And do you think with Tudor astrology, if there was a focus in the media on it, do you think that there is a way to make sure it has been portrayed accurately? Because there is a lot of things that can go wrong with historical portrayals. Do you think that Tudor astrology has enough information behind it to ensure that an accurate portrayal is produced?
Are you talking about me personally, or are you talking about what information there is regarding the astrology of the Tudor era?
In your personal opinion, do you think there's enough information to
Oh, yes,
portray?
absolutely. Absolutely, for sure. There is. I mean, there are people who have done incredible research on what the views were, what was the paradigm, and I think it could very easily and in a very interesting way, without being silly or stupid looking, to have such characters in, like, for example, Becoming Elizabeth. Let's just say that there was a second season of that. And you got to the point, the entire season of Becoming Elizabeth focused on her relationship with Thomas Seymour, most of it. You have also her relationship with Mary. Let's say there was a second season where Mary became queen. You could introduce somebody like John Dee. You could have that situation that occurred there. You could have John Dee and Robert Dudley character kind of meeting together with Elizabeth and talking about, her possible future. You could have a scene in which Elizabeth, when she's now ascending the throne, because that would be the grand finale, right, of Becoming Elizabeth, would be her ascension to the throne. You could have a scene where she asks Dr. Dee to find that moment. And then you could basically, maybe, since he was really good friends with Robert Dudley, you could also have him explaining to Robert Dudley exactly why this is a great moment. Why is he choosing this moment? And apparently he wrote an entire treatise on why he chose the moment, but that treatise is lost. We can only see it from the actual moment that he chose. We could determine it was great. But he actually wrote down all the reasoning behind why he chose that moment of January 15th, 1559, at 12 noon, all of that. He wrote it all down. So you could have developed that, and I think it would give astrology a little bit of a boost, because proof is in the pudding. Was she a great queen? Did he choose the right moment for her? I don't think time goes by where somebody mentions Elizabeth I and doesn't immediately say England's greatest monarch. Have you noticed that? I mean, basically, anybody talks about Elizabeth I, they almost immediately follow it with England's greatest monarch. And so I would say that the proof is in the pudding there.
I think I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's all we have time for today. So I just want to thank you
Okay.
so, so much, Sasha, for joining us today and helping our viewers learn a bit more about Tudor astrology.
Well, thank you, Emma. And it's a pleasure to talk with you. I appreciate it so much. And thank you for thinking of me and inviting me. And I hope we get to do it again sometime.
I hope so too. This is the ill-fated wives of Henry VIII signing off. Thank you.
Thank you.